Okay.
So I want to thank you for being here. I have come to speak on behalf of 350 Bay Area, whom you know well. Jennifer Wells spoke here, I believe, in April. We are a grassroots organization who is striving to effect drastic reductions in greenhouse gas emissions while maintaining environmental justice and reaching out first to communities where they are, who are frontline, who are near a refinery that likes to blow up, or who are, for instance, having their homes burned down, or we are, in a sense, actually everybody is, in a sense, a frontline community.
You have to almost kiss it.
She said I have to almost kiss it.
Yeah.
What kind of film are we making here? Okay. Oh, thank you. So, we are, in a sense, a frontline community, and that's part of what I'm going to talk about today, because the air out there is not normal, and it's not good for us. And there's some things that we can do, but the big picture, so it's, remember, think globally, act locally, and that really applies to climate change, especially since in the current regime that we have, it's really, really hard to act from a federal level, but a lot can be done from a grassroots level. And 350 aims to do that, and I know you do too. You probably can tell me about as much about climate change as I can tell you. And I know that Jennifer Wells asked you this poignant question that I'll ask again. Do you all know, so it's doing it, okay. Do you all know what 350 means? And there's no scoring on this test, okay. So somebody just shout it out there.
Parts per million. A regional organization of carbon in the ozone, our atmosphere.
Exactly. The parts per million that could be associated with a good, livable climate. And this is something, okay, it's warming up. This is something, and so am I, that Bill McKibben and others thought of a long time ago as a practical target that we could aim for. And I think they really they got it kind of right on. Because at 350, the climate would be livable. We're now, if you're talking about carbon dioxide, at 407 or so, and if you're factoring the carbon effect, the greenhouse gas effect of methane, then you're actually dealing more like with 490 parts per million. So we're up there. And we'll talk a little bit about that, but you all know the science well. I know Jennifer went through it with you. You all are activists. So doctors have been, one thing you can say good about, there are some good things about doctors. Sometimes medicine is actually practiced well, and many doctors believe in single payer. So there are some good things. And tend to be respected. So in December of 2016, there was the American Geophysical Society meeting, and they decided, well, scientists who were rather shy, they attended the meeting, and they were part of a big group that protested, stood out in the streets, got out of their labs and into the streets, asking for action on climate change, demanding action on climate change. There were a lot of people there. And they said, well, you need as scientists take a white coat and get up and be photographed. And of course, 50% of them were just doctors who are kind of exhibitionists, including me. But it allowed me to take shots down at the crowd. And I don't mean to sound like Donald Trump, but it was actually a much bigger crowd. I caught it earlier. And I love this. This was captured by another doctor friend of mine about the truth that somebody had as a placard. Now I've been part, for 35 years of various kinds of protests and things, and I've seen funny signs. It's warming, it's us, we're sure. It's bad, we can fix it. But I've never seen one with citations. We're in a science crowd. Now, beautiful picture of this world, and what we want to preserve is not just that first shot of the Earth from outer space, but we want to preserve a world that is graced by life. And this is Mendocino County, a part that is not ablaze, and we pray that it won't be. But we are now being affected, and as you know, we're being affected more rapidly than would have been expected by the ravages of climate change, and this has been going on for quite a while. I'm going to focus on the medical effects. We're going to briefly romp through the science, and you know that thin layer is the atmosphere. So, you know, it's not very thick. Carl Sagan says, you take a globe, in grade school, and you take that classroom globe and you paint it with a very thin layer of varnish. And what you'll get is, if you scale it up, that's how thin our atmosphere is. And it has the correct proportion of gases that has allowed life to proceed on this planet for millions of years. I mean, we've had, not us, we came around about 150 million years, 150,000 years ago, but life itself. So when we talk about the sky, this is the sky we're talking about, not Shakespeare's in Hamlet, that most excellent canopy of the air. Look you. I don't want you to look quite that high into the stars. That thin layer is what we're talking about. And sun, earth, thin layer, solar radiation goes pretty well through that thin layer, is absorbed by the earth, especially darker places like oceans and earth that is exposed, for instance, is burned down in forest fires. Some of the energy is radiated back into space as infrared, and that layer that we're talking about of greenhouse gases, of carbon dioxide, just the right proportion, mainly carbon dioxide now, I think more methane than ever was, but just the right proportion has given us a Goldilocks effect, and some of it is radiated back down to the planet, has kept us just right, especially in the last 10,000 years, which have been pretty good for me, because that's after the last ice age. We survived that last ice age. It got pretty cold, but the Goldilocks effect persists, except we did a thing. We started burning fossil fuels, and it goes back before 1850 and the steam engine, back to the dark satanic mills, and burning oil, whale oil, and burning coal, things to try to make money and make life easier, somewhat more innocently than they are today, and unknown. But what we have seen now is that, watch the atmosphere, it thickens with a little luck. And because it's thickened, it's a thicker blanket, it's holding more of the heat on the planet. And there are many sources. I actually did kiss the microphone. There are many sources. We're going to talk more about fossil fuels than anything else, but agriculture, industrial agriculture, has disturbed a very important way of resorbing, of capturing CO2, partly through many means, including ruining the soil that has microbes, that has a whole ecosystem that absorbs carbon. And there are many other ways that we have, also the fact that we burn down forests in order to grow cattle so we can eat more meat. And my plea as a doctor and as a person whose diet I would try to call climatarian. So if you're a yogi, you're not going to even eat eggs. And if you're a vegan, you won't even eat milk. And my thing is that the lower on the food chain you eat, the better off you are. And there's ample evidence that beef, especially, promotes and probably initiates certain types of cancer, especially colon cancer. And there's plenty of epidemiologic evidence for that. So it's better to eat, the words of a science writer, he says, eat food. In other words, not the crap that glows in the dark that you see in the middle of the aisles and makes popping noises and has, day glow. Eat food, real food, mostly vegetables, and not too much. Once again, the fact that deforestation is taking away the lungs of the earth, also darkening the earth so it absorbs more heat. And you know that more fossil fuels keep getting emitted. We know we're in abrupt climate change. I'm preaching to the choir. in a church when I say that you've recognized there have been a few extraordinary hurricanes. There are some people who, my next door neighbors who are intelligent, who are college educated, when I talk to them about the fires that are occurring in Northern California, you know, I said, this is climate change. The question was, well, do you really think so? In Berkeley. So we really have to get the education out. And anybody here who wants to become a speaker, tell me. So you know that the last 400,000 years is full of ice ages, other dips down into the 180 range of CO2 parts per million, and then you can barely see that at the very far end of the slide. You can see that last ice age, and then 1950 is happens very quickly. And remember, if you saw An Inconvenient Truth, that Al Gore gets on his ladder, and once he gets to the point that's going rapidly uphill, first he's just walking and pointing at things. Then he has to get on a ladder, and the ladder goes to the top of the theater. And that's dramatic, but it is true, and it is scaled correctly. We are in a period that humankind and most of the natural world for millions of years, that's true to say, millions of years, have never seen that level of carbon in the atmosphere. And it tracks directly with the heating. The heating is not yet as dramatic because 93% of it has gone into the ocean, but it's dramatic enough to give us hurricanes that are devastating, floods that are killing, and fires that are burning down my state and other places. Just a graphic that you've seen before, probably showing you that during the period from 1880 to 2016, we see the darker colors becoming not only more prominent, but we see colors we never saw before. And this is actually from direct measurement. You notice that the Arctic is warming more, and that has a lot of, and if we have time for questions, I can explain why that's so important. Another example of how everything is shifting toward heating. And so the medical profession has spoken out. There are many groups, I'm going to list several. There is a consortium of the medical society that is a consortium of 11 groups in this country that represents 50% of all the doctors. It includes the AMA, which if they went for single payer, I'd join. Physicians for Social Responsibility, which is taking a strong stand on climate change. And the Lancet Commission, which is the second best medical journal in the world after the New England Journal of Medicine, of course, that basically came out with this statement, and they stood behind it. And in their June 22nd, 2015, the whole issue was devoted to climate change. It was a very long issue. And one thing they noted in their introduction is something that I find fascinating and horrifying. It turns out, even when you're not talking about the direct effects of climate change, so you're not talking about, sea level rise, and you're not talking about things like loss of crops, but you're talking about the days of life loss, the days of productivity at work, the illnesses that have to be paid for because of fossil fuels at ground level, which we're going to talk about today. That's the local. Because of those things, the world gives a subsidy, or at least it did in 2014, of $5.3 trillion free to the fossil fuel industry for their externalities, to poison, to kill, to take away our productivity and our quality of life. That's what they get for free. And that's what we pay them. What is very interesting, a coincidence, and for that year, is that's the exact same amount of money, maybe round off at the dollars, $5.3 trillion were spent worldwide on healthcare itself. That's how much we give the fossil fuel industry. And that is obscene, in my opinion. So we have the extreme weather events. And what I'm going to do to try to make this work in a way that That makes some sense. It's complicated to talk about human health and climate change because there's so many ways things intertwine. Global intertwines with local. I mean, why is it hotter here? It isn't just because we're burning more fossil fuels here. It's a global effect, so we have to be aware of that. But let's go by, in a way, effect by effect. So let's talk about the fact that we're drying out. Now, some people I've noticed when I talk to about climate change who are kind of on the fence, the ones who say, oh, no, it's God's will, just, say, bless you and walk away. But there are people who say, well, look, if there are rainstorms in California, and this is a common concept, we had a lot of rain, the drought's over, right? I mean, how many of you have heard that? Probably some. And it doesn't work that way. But you can understand where the thinking comes from. You have conservation of matter. The water didn't go into outer space. It's that the heating of it made it perform differently. When you warm up the oceans, your tropical cyclones, your hurricanes become more violent, supercharged, on steroids, if you will. They may have happened anyway, but probably not as many and certainly not as strongly. The same thing happens, so that warm air holds more water vapor, and the warm water supercharges the storms. At the same time, the warmth causes drought. And this is an important thing because you can have drought within the same year, even within a few months, alternating with floods. Here's a few. I usually just show local. This is Sao Paulo, Brazil. But you see the same thing in the San Joaquin Valley, where I spent my deformative years, just probably no comment. We also, and this is a medical effect, we also find that the amount of food that we grow, with each 1 degree Celsius, with 1.6 degrees Fahrenheit, with each rise, that small rise, you get 10% reduction in the amount of food available. Now, you may say, 10%, that's not so bad, I got lots of Pop-Tarts. But most of the world, it is not like us. And we have a different kind of eating problem, although there's hunger in this country. Rest assured of that. However, 800 million people, nearly 1 billion people around the world live with food scarcity, with not even enough calories or barely or not enough protein. So when you get a 10% reduction and you already have 1 billion people in a growing population, that is very big. So that's one aspect. Water scarcity, I have to mention that. I mean, there are already places that are actually fighting battles over water. And a lot of this happens in the Middle East. It's going to get worse. Not because the water went into outer space, but because if it stays in the warm air, or it floods down in big storms, we'll get to that in a minute, then, it actually isn't that usable. It runs off, it doesn't stay in aquifers, and it isn't there reliably. So let's talk about some of the heat issues, including the details of heat stress. We know that heat stress, and by that I mean a spectrum of things that start off with just, I've got cramps, to I'm in a coma. So there's a whole spectrum of things medically that occur when we talk about heat stress. The most minor is that heat cramps. So you might notice, and I don't know if this has ever happened to anybody here, maybe you were working outside, gardening, or doing other kinds of manual labor, and you started to feel, and it's hot, relatively hot, and you start feeling cramping in your thighs, and I just need to get in the shade and drink some water. That's what that is, and it's not that serious. We always say that the worst type, the worst two types of actual heat intoxication, if you will, are the heat exhaustion, which then goes into heat stroke, and there's no clear dividing line. Who is most vulnerable? The very, very young and the older. But other people are too. So you can be a strapping 26-year-old working outside, and if it's 95 degrees and you don't have enough water, these things can happen to you too. So I do not want to dispel the fact that, oh well, young people, they're fine. And athletes, another group that sometimes in schools it's like, you know, be macho and don't drink any water and keep running. So those are the groups that are the most vulnerable, truly are the very young, the people who have concomitant medical problems like diabetes, like lung disease, like heart disease. They are the most vulnerable, but they're not the only ones. And also people who do not have luxuries, who live in what we call, in many cases, frontline communities, don't necessarily have air conditioning. They do not necessarily have a place to go to cool, and they do not necessarily have access to water as much as they would need. So the first one I told you, heat cramps, gave you a picture of what that would be like. It's, you know, pour water on that person, put some, you know, ice from your coat into their armpits, and they're usually going to be fine unless it lasts longer than an hour. But do not attempt a lot of activity when you have a temperature that's high. Now I'm going to go into a question of what is high. So I said 95 degrees. As a general rule, that's pretty right. You know when you walk out into 95 degrees. Like I said, I spent my formative years in Bakersfield. I mean, one of the best things about Bakersfield, I used to say, was valley fever. But that's rude. I don't mean that. But it's gotten better. But the thing is, it's really hot and it's gotten hotter. That doesn't feel comfortable. But here's what can make it worse. If you're a healthy person, spending an hour or two in 95 degrees and have access when you need it to water, you're okay. But there are a couple other things that play a role, mainly humidity. So at about 30 degrees Celsius, which is 86 degrees Fahrenheit, I think, even at 86 degrees, which really isn't that bad, I think we could get there today, that if the humidity is high, then you have to factor that into. And there are indices that are plotted to do this. So at 86 degrees, a young healthy person, if the humidity is 75%, they can't sweat. And at 100%, they can't sweat at all. And sweating is our natural defense against heat. When we sweat, we cool off, and the water evaporates, and then what happens is cooling. It's our primary way of protecting ourselves. So remember, it isn't the precise temperature. 95 is bad, don't stay in it very long. But lower temperatures with high humidity are also bad. Next step was heat exhaustion. I'm kind of skipping through this, that if you start to feel really, really tired or start to hear sounds like phones making noises, you might be having some kind of neurologic issues. And that's really okay, I do that. So the core temperature in your body might be elevated. It might be 101 even at core. But here's the deal. I wouldn't mess with this because it's hard to draw a line between I'm feeling really exhausted and the sensation of, you know what, I don't even know who I am. I'd rather, especially in these days of traffic and long waits in emergency rooms and trying to get to a doctor, probably if you feel you have strong heat exhaustion symptoms, I would seek medical attention. Okay, there have been very famous heat waves recently that have killed people. They have something like 750 died in Chicago in 1995, I believe, and it was probably a lot more than that. Because here's the deal, if you have heart disease and lung disease, we'll get to that, you're more prone to die of that condition because of stresses on your system. You were programmed to run nearly 98.6 as core temperature, and you're not supposed to deviate too far from that. A lot of people don't know this. Well, I'm going to ask how many do. Did you know that in Europe, we're not talking, Central Asia or we're talking about Europe, that 70,000 people died 1 August in 2003 from heat. Okay, it wasn't covered in any news I was watching. The Petroleum Broadcasting System, PBS. I make that mistake. They're funded by Coke, and I didn't hear any reports about that. And you think, well, okay, Maybe they lived in small communities and little villages and they didn't have any air conditioning or cooling stations or doctors or whatever. And some of that was true. But in the city of Paris alone, I'm going to now get a little tangential, but in the city of Paris alone, 11,000 people died in 2003 from a heat wave. Now in 2010 another one occurred, but they had set up cooling stations and only maybe 4,000 people died. Now I want to say that, and I'm trying to say this sensitively, we had in November of 2000 and, what was that? That was 2015? We had 130 people killed in a horrible terrorist attack that cannot be defended, that was horrible, abominable. We also had 11,000 people in 2003, and this is just one example, who died. And they didn't die because of pure hatred. There was no true malice aforethought for any individual. What they did die of is something that was known about by ExxonMobil, by other fossil fuel magnates. They knew this that could happen. They knew it would happen. They didn't know exactly where or when these events will happen and do happen. But 11,000 people died. Now, if you kill somebody for money, it seems to me that that's your hitman. So if 11,000 people were taken out by the fossil fuel industry, my comment is simply there are lots of kinds of terrorism. And on a lighter note, not really, cardiovascular illnesses, so I just wanted to tie that in. Another thing that happens in the heat, and something one should always be aware of. And I do want people to take precautions and make sure you have a lot of water. And any questions about that, if I can read the watch to see what time it is. Go ahead.
Yeah, is it often that you're not thirsty, but you still need water? See, that part I don't understand. I think that you should feel thirsty, you need water.
That's an interesting question. People vary in their sense of need for water. It's usually a reliable instinct. For most people, they will crave water when they're getting dehydrated. But if they rapidly go into heat exhaustion, they may not know what they crave. So the other signs, the signs of being a little delirious, the signs of just being, I can't move any water, I don't care about water, but I can't move. That's hospital. Good question. I mean, if they're just, I'm tired, I want to go in the house and lie down, that's a little different and they're still making sense. This is sort of a judgment call. That's heat exhaustion. And if the person is, tunes up within a few minutes in a cooler place, I would still have them drink water. But if they don't tune up quickly, hospital. Yeah, everybody, because I know the emergency rooms and, but you don't, this is a very serious issue. So cardiovascular diseases are also exacerbated by the local levels, by the local effects of climate change, including, well, what do? When we want to let go of heat, we vasodilate. We are that vessels in the periphery of our body, they open up to let the heat out. And when that happens, your blood pressure drops. And when you drop the resistance in a system, you got to raise it somehow, so the heart has to beat harder and faster. So if perchance you had some heart issues that never manifested even before, or that had, your heart will have to work harder, and there's an increase in the risk for myocardial infarction and congestive heart failure. So that's one of the reasons cardiovascular disease is exacerbated. Also, the ozone in the system can cause arrhythmia. So in especially urban areas where there's lots of fossil fuel use, lots of factories, lots of car driving, you have more ozone. And that is extremely toxic to a number of organs, but to the heart, it can cause arrhythmias and myocardial infarctions. It can cause respiratory conditions and in children. and anyone. But I just show a child because the airways can become inflamed. There are indirect effects of heat on public health and on local health, including the things we all like to look at. The little arthropods here, infectious disease that are vectors. So you have a virus or perhaps a protozoan inside a vector, which could be a mosquito, and often is a mosquito. Other things like mites and rodents can carry them too. So this is what's happening, is that we're seeing a spread northward as we warm up of all kinds of infectious diseases. And recall that Zika is carried by a bug I may show you in a minute, that's called Aedes aegypti. And it also will carry, I love this name, chikungunya, which sounds like something you'd order at Taco Bell. And it also can carry dengue fever, which I've seen here actually from somebody who is traveling, but I've seen in California before. It's really awful. And it can carry, of course, Zika. And do we have such mosquitoes? I'll show you that we do. So all these diseases are moving northward, and it's somewhat troubling when you look at Cryptococcus, and that can be also waterborne, and for immunosuppressed patients, a very dangerous fungus indeed. So let's look at Aedes aegypti and notice that we got it here. So if we, it is possible to have outbreaks, and there have been some cases reported in the United States, in the Southeast. And here's our bug. What I'm saying about her is true about the Anopheles mosquito that carries malaria. And we've had malaria outbreaks in this country. And they tend to obviously expand their environment as things get warmer. They like the warmth. So we're seeing that in Asia, Africa, that they're moving northward. And they also party when it's hot. They tend to they like to reproduce when the heat's on. And they do a lot of it. And they often have a number of cycles of reproduction a year so that there's more of the mosquitoes around. In addition, they have more generations born each year because they are mating more, and the metabolism of the mosquitoes increases, so that means what do they need? They need more blood. So there's a greater chance for an epidemic to occur. So you see how the heat can bring on epidemics in multiple ways through these vectors. They bite more often too. I don't know if it's because they're mad because it's hot, or they're just energized, or they're hungry. And the last point is reiterated. So the virus, in this case we're talking about Zika, becomes more prevalent. This is to remind me that malaria does the same thing. Do we have Anopheles mosquitoes in the United States? Is the Pope a chemist? Well, he is. But yes, we do. I remember when I was working in a hospital in 1969, 16-year-old, the first class of non-lab techs that were allowed to draw blood. They called us phlebotomists, which were really venipuncturists. And we had veterans coming back from Vietnam who unfortunately had developed drug abuse problems, intravenous drug abuse problems. And they were spreading the malaria virus in the little town of Bakersfield, and not so little. And the CDC came to investigate, and we would do these thick smears and look for the actual, the protozoan that is the malaria itself, the malaria parasite. And so we have had outbreaks in this country, and we can have them again. And there are other things we really love. I mean, I love rats. They're really sweet animals. But what they carry isn't often so sweet. So I frequently talk about climate change. And I mention the rat in this sense, is that what we're dealing with in climate change globally now, I'm kind of turning to the global side, is something that could be worse than the bubonic plague. And it makes the bubonic plague, in fact, look like a very bad rash. And that's sounds harsh, but what I mean by that is only numerically, not for individuals. Because, yes, in the 14th century, 50% or so of Europe died from the Black Plague. But with climate change, if it goes unabated, if it goes without our efforts and our all hands on board doing all kinds of things, if it isn't handled rapidly, then we're dealing with issues that are greater, that could spell out the collapse of civilization, of the natural world, and even human extinction, which you have to admit is a big public health problem. Maybe the mother of them. Then we have mites, people like Lyme disease, and that's increasing. So they're cute, not so much. And I don't want to show you a bunch of pictures of wildfires. You've been watching them on the news constantly. I just want to warn you that these exposure, I want you to be really careful about not, and I think everybody here knows that, you're not going out, and especially on a smoky day, even though some of the most dangerous particles you can't see, but the smoke is often a marker for when you shouldn't be exercising outside. So if you go to a gym that has good air conditioning and try to go in the morning, I would recommend that when you're surrounded by smoke. The smoke from wildfires is incredibly dangerous. Some of the resins from some trees, and I can't cite them all, are toxic when inhaled. In addition, there are industrial things that are burning down. We don't know what they all are. Building materials. So, of course, the people who need help right away should be getting it. We should be caring for them. But we are those people too. And we should be very careful that we do not expose ourselves heavily. And if you know people who are going into areas where exposure is great, or if they should be getting an N95 NIOSH masks to wear. And they're not the big things that make you look like the fly. They're actually like big medical particulate masks, so they're relatively easy to wear. I don't think every San Franciscan needs to be wearing them now, but people who are traveling in that direction should be. Okay. This is the rim fire in 2013, Yosemite, and the brave firefighters, beautiful picture, horrible scene. Now, this is not Yosemite, judging by the wildlife, but we have to remember that there are creatures besides the wonderful firefighters, besides us, and what do they have to defend them? So we have to think, many people, relate to animals more. I relate to life. But that's what also happens from wildfires. Now, I just want you to remember, this is called a town called Oroville, and it, in the same year, had an enormous fire. This is it. And then later, this dam broke and it flooded. That illustration I wanted you to make, that drought and flood can occur really within a few months of one another when the world is heated up. We have various strategies to adapt. I'm going to skip through some slides now. Air pollution is an important one. I'm going to, it's really more like 7 million people every year, and probably more than that, die from air pollution, because once again, the ozone and its effect on the heart, the polyaromatic hydrocarbons and their causation of cancer, there are, and the small particulate matter that can cause stroke, heart disease, at least lung cancer, probably other cancers, and probably dementia. We don't know how high the risk is, but one of the studies recently said that there was a 50% higher risk of developing dementia in women who are between like 50 and 65 if they are in areas of high particulate matter, PM 2.5 or PM 10 micro. So pollution is a local effect. I'll just say this hopefully very quickly, and that is that so ozone is produced, as I said, when there is the internal combustion engine and other kinds of fossil fuel combustion, and it's low to the ground ozone. We're talking about, in our communities. And what happened, there was one study that was excellent. that showed that in children who played 3 or more sports a year, not all at the same time, presumably, in areas of high ozone neighborhoods, that they had they were 3.3 times more likely to develop asthma. You take the same, and they deliberately had lots of sports so they could do the experiment well. You take the same group, number of people, in low ozone, maybe rural neighborhoods without industry, and those kids did not have an increase at all in the new onset of asthma. So that's an issue for children and for anybody dealing with chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. I am occasionally touching my nose because it's to illustrate, to make this interactive, about how pollen increases during times when there's more heat. And we've pretty much talked about air pollutants and allergies through my interactive demonstration. Particulate matter, I told you about small diameter, tiny particles that also carry along with them other toxins. And here's the interesting thing. So they're called the short-lived pollutants, and they include things like ozone, low to the ground methane, polyaromatic hydrocarbons, things like that, that if you stop them, if you stop the cars or the factory that's producing them. And there was an accidental case that was run here in LA where I think they were either filming a movie, because they do that in LA everywhere, for a couple of days, or there was a reason they had to stop traffic. And all 83% of those small particulates, the most toxic probably of all the air pollutants, went down. So you can clean up your neighborhood at ground level really quickly. And that's a good thing. It's just a good thing to know. So for the local level, hydrologic cycle, I'm kind of reiterating it, and you already know this, that water evaporates and goes around. The problem we have now is that the water is going into the air because the air is too hot, and it is warming the oceans. And that's giving us big storms like we've never seen before. This is, I lived in Arizona for a while, and you can see that it's splashing up when it hits. I don't remember a lot of those, but things like that are happening now. And this does not get into aquifers, it does not end droughts, it just causes erosion, it causes destruction of soil, and it does not help climate change. And there are a lot of Californians who don't know that. Remember I showed a picture earlier, I'm talking really fast now. I showed a picture earlier of a fire in a place called Oroville. Well, this is the Oroville Dam that same year. And I believe I can't remember which came first, but it has been up, the Oroville Dam has been there for kind of as long as you all have been here. I mean, not personally, 140 years. It never did this before. Could be a coincidence, but what happened is, maybe not quite that long, maybe less, but anyway, it's been there a long time. And it was almost breached. They had to actually let go of some of the water. Otherwise, the areas that were quite flooded and had to be evacuated around Marysville, Yuba City, that region near Sacramento. And this is the same year that there were fires. And that's the point that we have to try to convince our open-minded brothers and sisters about. That you can have them both at the same time. One does not negate the other. So Hurricane Harvey, no storm has ever dropped this amount of water in a single day. And part of that is because of the slowing of the jet stream. And the details of that are not so important. It's just the storms are not only huge, massive, much bigger than they would be without climate change, but they are often slowed down because the jet stream is slowed down. And so, not always, but this can happen. And that's probably the reason why Harvey was able to go so slow and do so much rain damage. This is Irma, where we are now allowing millions of Americans to suffer, die, lose their lives and their hopes and dreams, and I haven't got words that I should say near a church. This is just LA flooded. Flooding can cause mold issues that can be permanent and ruin a house and ruin a life. In all of these things, though I haven't said it, people who have psychiatric problems or people who might, or people are especially prone. They're in that list of groups with pre-existing illnesses that are especially prone to the harm. And and that could be increased psychological harm. It could be suicide. It could be not responding and just, depending upon what the particular condition is. In addition, people who haven't been depressed before can become depressed or anxious. So there is a psychiatric component here too. There are waterborne illnesses that are especially associated with flooding, and they include the following, which we can see, all of these we can see in this country, including what will happen, I guarantee you, cholera in Puerto Rico, where Americans live. And it's well known that most disease outbreaks of waterborne diseases happen after an extreme flood. Why? It is a climate emergency, and the good news, and we have a few minutes to do that. The slide's cut off, but what it's basically saying is that I think in one day, from wind alone, if we could harness all of it, which we don't want to do and we don't need to do, we could supply the world with energy 40 times over. This is on-the-shelf stuff. I mean, it's getting better and better each year, and the ability to store this power is getting better and better. But we can do that if we force our government to do it. And we forced our government to do things before, to end a vile war in Southeast Asia. We've forced them to act on the HIV plague, and on civil rights. There are many things we have forced our government to do. And one of the things is we start locally, but then we move up too. And with community choice programs in energy, we can help support that. And I hope that you become involved in those, because we're seeing a rapid upswing. The cost of the solar cells going down dramatically. There are countries that can just leapfrog over all of this. So this one, I believe, is in Sudan, but in Africa and in India, they don't have the grid. So like they did with cell phones, I mean, 20 years ago in India, getting a phone connection was dicey, if any of you traveled there. But now everybody's got a cell phone. I call friends in Bangladesh and India. It's not a problem. And so they can, in the same way, they can leapfrog over grids because they don't have them. So that's good news. The other good news is, looking at our old picture again, is that every hour of sunlight could supply us with energy for a full year. Now, obviously we don't want all that sunlight, we don't need that, and but it's not true that we'll burn out the sun. And there are more and more cars that are less polluting. Not everybody can afford a car at all. So anybody who does not, buy a Tesla, although they're making less expensive ones now, but the cost is going down for electric cars, and there are hybrids that are combinations of electric. These are good things. And of course, active transportation, if one is fit enough, and walking, if one can do it in the proper temperature, is quite good for you. And it is also, and of course, bicycling for those who can do it. Here we are again. What do? We have many campaigns, and I think you all have heard about them and know about them. I think that probably Jennifer talked about fossil fuel resistance, peacefully getting in people's faces. I love that. That's my favorite one. I love getting arrested. When the cuff goes on, I don't know, there's just something nice about that. Always peacefully. In civil disobedience. I mean, I don't like rob banks usually. So there's that. And fossil fuel resistance doesn't necessarily mean getting arrested. You can just be out on the street saying, I do not want bomb trains, oil trains going through Benicia. I do not want, and they won, I do not want coal being shipped through Oakland and poisoning the children and the people who are already at high risk from all the ozone and other crap in the air. And we won. There's a lawsuit against us. It's ridiculous. We will defeat it. There's the Bay Cap, the Bay Climate Action Plan, which deals with the air districts. You probably know about them, and one can give testimony there. There's the Speakers Bureau. Anybody who wants to be a speaker can be one. Anybody who needs a speaker, we will do this for free. It's a roadshow we offer, And there's a transportation campaign. So we have, and if you go to our website, and I will put out some flyers, hopefully before you escape, and you can pick them up. And you can go just to 350bayarea.org and look at the various campaigns, and anything that, in Joseph Campbell's words, allow you to follow your joy. Go with it. If you really like writing, going to, and lobbying, or analyzing legislative campaigns, we are extremely organized. We have a group of people who can tell you what you need to think about and meet with you. We have an interfaith campaign, and just some little pictures of us all in action. This is to show you that there is actually, so we talked about depression and anxiety. There is a social exhilaration when you work with other people, when you join a group, when you know you're fighting the greatest fight really for life that has ever been fought, the savior of our species and the natural world. So this was when we were about to win No Coal in Oakland, and we did. This is the Benicia group. I neglected to put in our colleagues who work so hard, who continue. We often are working with this in coalition with groups like Communities for a Better Environment, who are frontline communities in Richmond, where refineries regularly explode or do worse, or, well, that's about the worst, but they cause a lot of pollution, and they're trying to bring in tar sands now. This is just to remind me about the legislative campaign, very well organized. This is our State House. I wouldn't have decorated with those carpets, but it's beautiful on the outside. The Air District, working with them. And if you ever see all of these people in one place, sign them up on our sign-up sheet for 350. They make excellent activists. So we have an interfaith campaign too. And you can take it to the churches, to the synagogues, to the mosques, to the temples, wherever. And as I said, there is that social exhilaration. You're doing the best thing that ever can be done. And this is the People's Climate March on April 29th this year. And this is a version of it in Washington. So, yes, we had some dark clouds. We do have some dark clouds. And if you notice, they're a little orange tinged. But there's light breaking through, because the light can start with us working locally in our communities, defying as many communities, including like the Pittsburgh, when Trump said, I work for Pittsburgh, not for Paris or something. And then, of course, the mayor of Pittsburgh said, you know what? We're with the climate agreement. So things can happen locally, and we can overcome those issues, and that's those rays of light. They're us. They're us acting locally for global reasons. So yes, we want this blue marble. It's freaking beautiful. But it's much more than that. That will stay. As George Carlin said, the planet will be fine. But unless we do something about the environment, my words, and his words, you better pack your bags. We don't want you to pack your bags. We want you to remain, to be part of. There's a beautiful saying, one last saying I'll put in. I believe it's Talmudic, and I'll give my bad paraphrase. It is not incumbent upon you to complete the work, nor are you excused from beginning it. This is a moral call. This is a spiritual call. This is a call for life, for a planet graced by life. And I thank you for letting me address you, and I thank you for all you've done.